The night stretched across the Maasai plains like a velvet shroud, thick with the scent of rain-soaked dust and burnt firewood, and Amahal sat close to the dying flames, her camera resting beside her boots as she flipped through photos of lions under crimson skies and elephants marching through amber light, images that felt too alive, too aware. The silence around her was wide and ancient, the kind that carried voices from another time, until she felt it a shift in the air, a whisper in the grass, and then he appeared. A man stepped out from the shadows, tall and still, wrapped in white linen that glowed faintly in the firelight, his eyes deep and unreadable like the night itself. Amahal froze. Her pulse stumbled. The stranger tilted his head slightly, a slow smile tracing his lips as he said, "You shouldn't sit alone. The lions aren't the only hunters here." His voice was velvet low, rhythmic, dangerous. She wanted to stand, to speak, but her words dissolved on her tongue. "I'm waiting for my guide," she managed, her throat dry. The man took a step closer, his movements quiet as breath. "Guides can't protect you from everything," he murmured, his gaze sliding toward the photographs scattered near her feet. The fire cracked. The night leaned closer. Amel's heart hammered as he crouched and picked up one of the pictures, a close-up of a lion's eyes. "You took this near the Mara ruins," he said, almost absently. Her eyes widened. "Yes. How do you know that?" He smiled again, and this time it looked older, as if it carried centuries of memory. "Because I was there." The flames flared, throwing his shadow against the rocks like a beast stretching its claws. Amel's voice caught in her chest. "Who are you?" she whispered. He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the fire's gold. "Someone who remembers you," he said, and something cold moved through her veins. Thunder rolled across the plains, distant but growing. Lightning sliced the horizon, and for a heartbeat she saw him, illuminated, his expression calm, his presence almost holy, and then darkness swallowed him whole. He was gone. No footsteps. No sound, just the wind howling through the acacia trees and her own breath echoing in her ears. Amel's hands trembled as she gathered her things. The words he left behind clung to her mind like smoke. "You see beauty in wild things. Wild things see you back." That night she barely slept. Even when dawn cracked open the horizon and the birds began to sing, she could still feel eyes on her, watching, waiting, knowing. She didn't believe in curses or spirits, but deep inside she understood something had found her out there in the dark, something human enough to speak and dangerous enough to disappear. And if she ever met a man like that again, she should run. Amahal tried to convince herself that she had imagined him, that the stranger by the fire was nothing more than exhaustion and moonlight playing tricks on her. But back in Nairobi, the city refused to let her forget. The noise of the streets, the hum of traffic, the scent of rain on asphalt, everything seemed sharper, louder, alive. Days passed, yet every reflection she caught in car windows, shop glass, or the chrome of her camera lens carried the same faint outline of a man in white watching from a distance. At first, she told herself it was paranoia, but when she developed her film, she froze. In the background of her lion photograph, behind the tall grass, stood a blurred figure, the same broad shoulders, the same stillness. Her hands shook as she touched the print. It wasn't possible. She hadn't seen anyone when she took that shot. "You okay?" Nia's voice broke her trance. Her best friend stood in the doorway of the darkroom, brows furrowed. Amahal hesitated before nodding, just tired. But Nia's gaze lingered on the photo. Some spirits wear human faces, she said quietly, half joking, half afraid. Amahal laughed it off, yet that night her dreams betrayed her. She found herself back on the plains, the fire dying, the wind whispering her name. Malik stood on the other side of the flames, his eyes glowing like embers. "You left too soon," he said, his voice echoing in 1,000 directions. "You still owe the wild your name." She woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, the echo of thunder rolling through her apartment as a storm began outside. The next morning, she found a white feather on her balcony. There were no birds, no reason, just that feather, clean, perfect, cold to the touch. Amahal tucked it away, determined to push the thought of Malik from her mind, but the city seemed to pulse with his presence. At the cafe, she thought she saw him crossing the street. At the art gallery, she caught a glimpse of him in the reflection of a sculpture. Once, in the crowded market, she swore she felt someone brush her hand and whisper, "Still looking for lions." She spun around, but there was no one there. Fear began to mix with fascination. Who was he? How did he know her? The more she tried to run from the memory, the more it followed in dreams, in photographs, in moments between blinks. By the 7th night, she stopped turning off her lights. She sat by her window until dawn, her camera in her lap, the city glowing faintly beneath her. And though she could no longer see him, she felt him, watching, waiting, patient as the wind. Deep down, Amahal knew that he hadn't come to haunt her. He had come to claim something she hadn't yet realized she possessed. Amahal could no longer pretend the city was safe. Every street corner, every shadow seemed to hum with Malik's presence. And yet, despite the fear curling through her chest like fire, a part of her was drawn to him, pulled by a force she couldn't name. One evening, as the sun bled crimson over the rooftops, he appeared at the edge of her apartment balcony, silent and impossibly still, his white linen glowing faintly in the fading light. "You're running from what you are," he said softly, his voice both command and caress. "But you cannot hide from the blood that runs in your veins." Amal's breath caught. "I don't understand," she whispered. He extended a hand, glinting with rings that seemed older than the city itself. "Come with me," he said, "and I will show you the truth." Against every instinct, against the rational part of her mind screaming to flee, she followed him through winding streets, past markets where shadows twisted between the stalls, until they reached the outskirts of Nairobi, where the red earth began to swallow the concrete. There, in a grove, hidden from the road, lay an ancient shrine carved with symbols that hummed like they were alive. Candles flickered despite the wind, their flames bending as if obeying an invisible force. Malik turned to her, his eyes piercing, unyielding. "Your mother tried to hide it," he said, "but she could not erase what was yours. You carry the blood of queens." Amahal felt the world tilt, her knees weak, the wind whispering secrets she had never known. What does that mean?" she stammered. Malik's hand brushed her hair back, gentle and yet electric. "It means you were born for power, to see what others cannot, to command what the world fears. But every crown comes at a price." The firelight danced across his face, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. Part of her wanted to flee, to tear herself away from the pull of his gaze. Yet something deeper, older, told her she had come too far to retreat. Malik gestured to the carvings, the ancient marks glowing faintly in the candlelight. Tonight, you will decide if you are the hunter or the hunted. Amahal reached out to touch the cool stone, feeling the pulse beneath it, a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat, faster, louder, more insistent. She glanced at Malik, whose expression was unreadable, but whose eyes promised both salvation and ruin. And in that moment, standing in the shrine that smelled of earth, smoke, and old magic, she realized that whatever path she chose, nothing would ever allow her to return to the life she had known before, because the man in white had already claimed her story, and she had already glimpsed the power and danger that came with it. The night the eclipse swallowed the moon, Nairobi fell into a hush that felt unnatural, like the city itself was holding its breath. And Amahal knew, before Malik spoke, that something irreversible had begun. The streetlights flickered and died, plunging the avenues into shadows thick as velvet, and when she stepped outside, Malik was already waiting, white linen glowing faintly in the darkness, his eyes reflecting the thin crescent of hidden light. "Tonight," he said, his voice a low current of command and promise, "you must choose." His words sent shivers down her spine, and she realized the choice was never hers, at least, not entirely. She followed him through alleys where the wind whispered secrets in languages she could not understand, past buildings whose facades seemed to bend and shift, until the city dissolved behind them and the red plains of Masai Mara rose under the eclipsed sky. The air smelled of ozone and wild grass, and the distant roar of lions mingled with the pounding of her own heartbeats. Malik stopped at the edge of a rocky outcrop, pointing to the shadows stretching over the plains. "You can bind with me, Amahal," he said, "and walk between worlds. Or you can turn back and be left to the darkness that hunts those who refuse their fate." She wanted to run, wanted to scream, but something in his gaze rooted her in place. The eclipse deepened, the moon now a bleeding ring, casting an otherworldly glow over everything. Malik lifted his hand, and the air itself seemed to ripple, the grass bending as if alive. "You are more than a hunter, more than a witness. Tonight you step into what you were born for, or you fall into shadows that have waited for centuries." Amahal felt the ground tremble beneath her, a pulse that matched her own, and she saw in the darkness shapes that seemed to watch, to hunger, yet not a one dared move, while Malik's presence held the plains like a shield. Fear, desire, and awe tangled in her chest, each breath tasting of electricity and rain. She reached for him, her fingers brushing the hem of his linen, and in that instant the world blurred, the shadows shifted, the air sang, and she understood there was no turning back. Malik smiled, that same dangerous, magnetic smile, and whispered, "Now, Amahal, you are mine, and the wild will follow your every step." She felt it, the power, the thrill, the terror, the pull of something larger than life, larger than herself, wrapping around her like the eclipse wrapping the moon. And though she had wanted to run, she could not. She wanted to run, but she had already stepped into the night, into the world he promised, into a destiny both terrifying and intoxicating. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that once a shadow like Malik found you, there was no escape. The days after the eclipse felt unreal, as if the world itself had tilted on its axis. and Amahul could no longer distinguish between reality and the pull of Malak's presence, which seemed to follow her like a shadow that refused to be outrun. Even in the bustling streets of Nairobi, she felt his eyes on her, watching from alleys' windows, and reflections she had no reason to see. She tried to focus on her photography, on the ordinary rhythms of life. But every click of her camera echoed like a heartbeat that drew him closer, and every photograph seemed to capture shapes and movements she could not explain, silhouettes in white linen, glimmers of eyes in the dark, figures that dissolved when she turned her head. Her friends noticed the change in her. Nia confronted her one evening as they walked through a crowded market. Amahal, you're not yourself. You're disappearing into something you can't see. You need to fight it. Amahal wanted to agree, wanted to shake off the feeling that the world was shifting beneath her. But when she returned to her apartment that night, Malik was waiting, as if summoned by her very heartbeat. You've seen too much, he said softly, his hand brushing against hers, sending shivers of both fear and longing down her spine. You cannot unsee, you cannot undo what has been set in motion. She wanted to pull away, to slam the door and lock herself in, but a part of her, a dangerous, thrilling part, longed for him, longed for the knowledge, the power, the mystery he offered. And then the whispers began, faint voices in the corners of her mind, shadows flickering at the edge of her vision, secrets spilling into her thoughts like poisoned rain. Malik guided her to an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the city, where the walls were etched with symbols she recognized from the shrine. Those who claim the power must pay the price, he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light. He handed her a small carved talisman, heavy and warm in her hand. This is your choice. Accept it, and you will see the truth. Refuse, and the shadows will consume what you love. Amahal clutched the talisman, feeling an electric pulse run through her veins, and for a moment she wondered if she had already been consumed. Fear twisted with desire, confusion battled clarity, and she realized that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The city around her seemed smaller, diminished, and she understood that Malik was no ordinary man. He was a force, a storm, a shadow, and she was now irrevocably caught in his orbit. As she left the warehouse that night, the streets silent and cold, she felt the world shift again, and the whispers of unseen eyes pressed closer, reminding her that in the game Malik played, there was no victory without surrender, no safety without risk, and no escape once the shadow had marked you. Amahal stood on the edge of the Maasai Plains once more, the wind whipping her hair across her face as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in molten gold and crimson, and she knew that the moment of truth had arrived. Malik stood before her, white linen glowing faintly against the dying light, eyes like molten obsidian that held centuries of secrets, power, and danger. And in that instant she felt both terrified and exhilarated, as if her very soul had been stretched to the breaking point. Tonight you choose, he said softly, each word heavy with gravity, to claim what is yours, or to abandon it and walk back into the shadows. Her fingers tightened around the talisman he had given her, its pulse syncing with the rhythm of her heart, and she realized that the path forward was no longer simple or safe. Memories of their encounters, campfire nights, whispered words in abandoned alleys, the eclipse, The shadows of betrayal flooded her mind like a river breaking its banks, each one a test, a step, a warning that she had ignored at her own peril. Fear wrestled with desire. The part of her that wanted to run, to reclaim the normal life she once had, screamed with a fury that rivaled the roar of distant lions. Yet another part, deeper and more primal, pulled her toward him, toward the unknown, toward the power and the promise he held out like a beacon. Malik stepped closer, and the air around them seemed to shimmer, the plains themselves bending slightly under the weight of the choice, the wind whispering in ancient tongues that Amahal could almost understand. "You are not just a witness," Malik said, voice like smoke and fire entwined. "You are a force. You either embrace it or be destroyed by it." Her chest burned with the knowledge of what lay ahead. Accepting him meant walking into a world of shadows, magic, and power beyond comprehension. Yet refusing would condemn her to a life haunted by what she could have been. Always aware of the force she had turned away from, she closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of earth, fire, and distant rain, feeling the pulse of the land, the heartbeat of the plains, and for the first time, she understood that choice was not simply about survival, it was about destiny, courage, and the surrender of fear. When she opened her eyes, she reached for Malik, letting her fingers brush his, letting the light of the dying sun catch in her gaze. And in that single, irrevocable act, she chose. The world seemed to exhale, the plains stretching endlessly around them. And though the wind whispered of storms to come and shadows that would follow, Amahal felt an unshakable power coursing through her veins, a clarity she had never known. And she realized that in surrendering to the force that had found her, she had also claimed herself, forever bound to a destiny that was terrifying, intoxicating, and magnificently hers. Malik smiled, the dangerous, magnetic smile that had haunted her dreams and her fears. And together they stepped forward into the night, the plains wide and waiting, the world holding its breath as the story of the woman who dared to run and chose instead to stand began its new, unstoppable chapter.